The last time I stood in front of my father, he was not wearing his judge's robe. He was standing in the kitchen with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his voice sharp with anger as he called me the biggest disgrace to our family name. That was before Afghanistan, before I learned to fire a rifle in the dark, before I discovered that silence could save lives. Years later, I walked back into that same house in uniform, carrying scars no one could see. What I brought with me was far more dangerous than any weapon I had held overseas. I carried the truth. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if stories of courage and resilience speak to you. And share in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It always moves me to see how far these stories travel and whose hearts they reach. This is not only the story of a soldier. It is about what happens when the battlefield follows you home. It is about what happens when the enemy is not a stranger in a distant desert, but your own blood sitting across the dinner table. It is about the quiet war between love and legacy, about the moment when silence breaks and the truth finally walks through the front door. Above all, it is about one choice, the choice to protect my child from the same cycle of control and cruelty I once endured. That choice lit a fuse I had been carrying all my life, and once it burned, nothing in my family would ever be the same again. I came home in the fall of my 36th year, carrying 2 duffel bags, a box of medals I never looked at, and a silence so heavy it followed me like a shadow. 12 years of service in Afghanistan and Iraq had carved me into someone I hardly recognized in the mirror. My hair was shorter, my body leaner, my eyes sharper, but what had changed the most could not be seen. It was in the way I startled at fireworks, the way I scanned every room for exits, the way I held my daughter a little too tightly when the nightmares woke me in the middle of the night. The army had trained me to survive, but it had not taught me how to live again. Civilians think the hardest part of service is the combat itself. They do not understand that the real battle begins when the uniform comes off and the world expects you to slip back into your old skin as if nothing happened. But nothing is the same. The woman who left home at 24 was not the same woman who came back. I had seen too much, lost too many, and learned to bury grief in compartments I never opened. When I stepped off that plane, Ethan was there, waiting with Maddie on his shoulders. He had been my anchor through years of deployment, writing letters that smelled faintly of the paper mill where he taught, sending photographs of Maddie's first steps, her first words, her first day of preschool. He was not a soldier. He had never been to war, but he understood me in a way few people did because he never asked me to be anyone other than who I was. I remember the first night home. Maddie curled up beside me, her little fingers clutching my sleeve as if she knew I might vanish again. Ethan made dinner, simple pasta with too much garlic, and we ate at the table he had built by hand. It should have felt like peace. But the silence inside me roared louder than any battlefield. When a car backfired down the street, I dropped my fork and reached instinctively for a weapon that was no longer there. Ethan met my eyes and said nothing, just reached across the table and laid his hand over mine until my breathing steadied. That was the moment I realized love could be a kind of armor too. But love was not enough to silence the ghosts. Some nights I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing. The smell of sand and blood still vivid in my mind. I had carried men onto helicopters who never came back. I had memorized the faces of children whose lives ended before they began. I learned to smile through it for Maddie's sake, to play the role of mother who read bedtime stories and packed school lunches. But inside, I was still Sergeant Hayes, trained to fight, unable to rest. Coming home also meant coming back to my father's town. Judge William Hayes was not a man who forgave easily, least of all his own daughter. He believed in legacy, in the weight of our family name, in appearances that gleamed like polished wood but hid the rot beneath. When I enlisted, he said I had thrown away everything. I was supposed to be the lawyer who carried on his reputation, not the soldier who dirtied her hands in a desert war. He called me a disgrace, and I carried that word into battle like a scar carved under my skin. My mother never spoke against him. She nodded, poured another drink, and carried on with her charity luncheons as if nothing had happened. My younger brother Nathan followed the path my father laid out for him. Law school, clerkship, and a career in politics waiting just around the corner. To them, family meant obedience. To me, family meant survival. So when Ethan suggested we move back after my retirement, I hesitated. but Maddie deserved to know her roots, and part of me wanted to prove that I could build a life in the same soil that once rejected me. We bought a small house on the edge of town, not far from the high school where Ethan taught history. It was modest. Nothing like the mansion I had grown up in, but it was ours. For the first time in years, I unpacked boxes of dishes, hung curtains, planted flowers in the yard, small acts of claiming a home. The first time I ran into my father was at the grocery store. He was in the aisle with imported wines, wearing his tailored suit as if the courtroom followed him everywhere. He looked older, his hair silver, his shoulders still broad, but his eyes carried the same judgment. He glanced at me, then at Maddie holding my hand, and nodded curtly. No hug, no words of welcome, just a nod as if acknowledging a neighbor, not a daughter. Maddie looked up at me and whispered, "Who is that man?" I swallowed hard before answering, "He is your grandfather." That was how it began, the uneasy return, the quiet war between the life I had built and the one I had left behind. I tried to keep distance. We visited on holidays, sitting stiff at the long dining table while my father asked Nathan about his latest case and ignored the medals on my chest. He never asked about the war, never asked what I had seen or lost. In his world, soldiers were tools, not people. In his world, appearances mattered more than truth. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it. And as I settled into civilian life, teaching Maddie how to ride her bike, sitting in the bleachers at Ethan's school events, I began to sense that the war inside me was not the only one waiting. There was another battle looming, one that would not take place on foreign soil, but here, in my own family, in the very house where I had once been told I was nothing. I thought retirement would mean rest, but in many ways it was the hardest mission of all. The Army gave me structure, orders, a purpose etched into every waking hour. Civilian life gave me freedom, and freedom can feel like a void when you have spent over a decade following commands. The mornings were the worst. In Afghanistan, I woke at dawn, boots laced before the sun rose, every moment dictated by the sound of whistles and the crackle of radios. At home, I woke to birdsong and Maddie's laughter drifting from her bedroom, and sometimes I felt adrift, as if the floor itself might crumble without that rigid frame holding me steady. Ethan sensed it before I admitted it. He knew when I needed space, when the silence grew too heavy, when my hands trembled without reason. He never said I was broken. He never asked me to talk about things I was not ready to share. Instead, he built a rhythm for us. Breakfast at 7. Walks in the park with Maddie after school. Evenings at the kitchen table with lesson plans spread out beside my unopened box of medals. It was not the same as the Army, but it was a kind of order, gentle and human, one that reminded me that purpose could be found in small things. Still, the memories came. The sound of rotor blades spinning across the sky, the metallic scent of blood in the sand, the look in the eyes of a boy who could not have been more than 12. Eyes that still haunted me when I closed my own. I carried them with me into the grocery store, into the church pew, into Maddie's classroom on parent-teacher night. They were ghosts no one else could see, shadows only I felt at my shoulder. Sometimes Ethan would catch me staring out the window long after midnight. He would come sit beside me, his warmth anchoring me back to the present. Once, in a moment of raw honesty, I whispered that I was afraid the war had taken away the best parts of me. He shook his head and said, "The best parts of you are right here. They are the parts that held on through the worst, and they are the parts that love us now." His words were simple, but they reached a place inside me that had been locked away for years. Maddie became my greatest teacher. She did not care about rank or medals or the things I carried. She only cared that I showed up, that I read her favorite stories in silly voices, that I clapped at her dance recital, that I held her hand when she was nervous at the dentist. Children do not demand explanations, they just demand presence. And in giving her that, I began to stitch myself back together. But every healing wound is vulnerable, and mine was tested the day my father called. His voice was as cold as I remembered, clipped and precise, the way he addressed juries from the bench. He invited us to Sunday dinner, not requested, not asked, but invited as if it were a civic duty. Ethan hesitated when I told him. He knew how I felt about that house, how every brick carried the weight of my father's disapproval. But Maddie's eyes lit up at the idea of meeting her grandparents properly, and I could not bring myself to say no. Walking into that house again was like stepping into a time capsule. The mahogany furniture gleamed, the paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, the smell of polish and bourbon filled the air. My mother greeted us with a smile that did not reach her eyes, her arms thin, her pearls perfectly strung. My father stood at the head of the dining table, Nathan beside him, both of them in pressed suits as if the meal were a courtroom session. He looked at Ethan first, his gaze sweeping over the simple tie, the calloused hands of a teacher, and I saw the judgment settle like dust. Then his eyes landed on Maddie, who clung to my hand, curious and shy. For the briefest moment, his expression softened, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He welcomed us with words that carried no warmth, only formality. Dinner was a trial in every sense. He asked Nathan about his latest case, praised his eloquence, spoke of his bright future. When the conversation turned to me, he asked how civilian life was treating me, the words heavy with condescension. Before I could answer, Ethan spoke with quiet pride about my years of service, about the medals tucked away in a box. My father's mouth tightened. Service is respectable, he said, but real legacy comes from building institutions, not destroying them. The room went silent. Maddie looked at me wide-eyed, sensing the tension even if she did not understand it. I wanted to stand to tell him what war really meant, to show him the scars beneath my uniform. But I stayed seated, pressing my hand against Maddie's back, reminding myself that sometimes silence is not weakness but restraint. Ethan squeezed my knee under the table, grounding me in the moment. When we left that night, Maddie asked why Grandpa never smiled. I told her some people forget how. She thought about it for a moment, then said maybe we can teach him. I smiled, but inside I knew some lessons come too late. Still, that night planted a seed. The old conflict between us had not faded with time. It had only waited, patient and coiled, ready to rise again. And deep down, I sensed that my return home would not be about rest at all. It would be about confrontation, about truth, about whether the soldier I had become could finally face the man who had once made me believe I was nothing. When people talk about childhood, they usually speak of summers that stretched forever, the smell of grass after rain, the safety of a parent's arms. For me, childhood was measured in the weight of silence. My father's silence when he disapproved, my mother's silence when she looked away, my own silence when I learned that speaking up only made things worse. Judge William Hayes ruled our home the way he ruled his courtroom. His word was final, his expectations ironclad, and his temper quick to ignite when those expectations were not met. He believed fear was the purest form of discipline. If he could not earn respect, he demanded obedience. He called it structure. I called it survival. I learned to read his moods the way other children read storybooks. The slam of the car door in the driveway told me if the evening would be safe or stormy. The way he set down his briefcase signaled whether dinner would pass in silence or in sharp criticism. My mother played her role like an actress in a play that never ended. She smiled at the table, passed the potatoes, and never once challenged the man who chipped away at us with words sharper than any blade. Nathan was always the golden child. He learned early to mimic my father's values, to shine under the spotlight of expectation. Straight A's, debate team captain. Law school admissions. I loved my brother, but I also envied him because his survival strategy was acceptance while mine was defiance. And defiance came with consequences. Every time I asked why, every time I pushed back, every time I cried out for fairness, I was met with the same cold dismissal. You are a disappointment. You are a disgrace. There was one person who saw me, really saw me. My mother's older brother, Robert. He was a Marine. Broad-shouldered with a voice that carried authority, but also warmth. He came to visit when I was 12, and I remember the way he placed a hand on my shoulder after my father had stormed out of the room. He told me that strength was not always loud, that sometimes strength was simply standing when someone wanted you to kneel. He taught me how to throw a baseball in the yard, how to sharpen a pocket knife, how to hold my chin high even when my father's words weighed it down. When Robert deployed overseas, my heart cracked. Letters came now and then, short and steady, reminding me that someone out there believed in me. Then one day they stopped. Life swallowed him whole, and he disappeared from our orbit, just another shadow my father allowed to fade. Years later, long after I returned from the army, Robert found me again. It was at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with chipped mugs and waitresses who called everyone honey. I had taken Maddie for pancakes after school when I saw him at the counter, his back straight despite the years, his hair silver but his eyes unmistakably the same. My heart stuttered. I had seen comrades rise from the dead in dreams, but seeing Robert again felt like one of those impossible miracles that somehow made it into daylight. He stood and smiled, and in that smile I was 12 again, the girl who believed she was worth saving. He knelt to Maddie's level, introduced himself as her great-uncle, and within minutes she was telling him about her favorite books and how her daddy made the best chocolate chip cookies. Watching them together, I realized how much I had missed, how much I needed him. Even now, over coffee, Robert asked about my deployments. I told him little because how could I compress 12 years of sand and blood into a conversation over pie? But I told him enough. He listened without judgment, without pity, only with understanding that comes from one warrior to another. Then his voice dropped lower, steady but firm. He told me he had been watching from a distance, that he knew things about my father, things he wished were not true. The words chilled me. I thought I had left the battlefield behind, but Robert's tone told me another kind of war was waiting, one that wore suits instead of uniforms. He hinted at political favors, at backroom deals, at justice bent for those who could pay. I felt a knot form in my chest. My father was many things, but I had always believed in his devotion to the law. It was the one pillar that seemed unshakable. To hear otherwise felt like hearing the foundation of my world cracking underfoot. I tried to push it aside. My plate was full with healing, with mothering, with building a life alongside Ethan. But once you hear the rattle of danger, you cannot unhear it. I began to notice small things. The way Nathan spoke in clipped tones about his cases, the sudden wealth he could not quite explain. The phone calls he took in hushed voices when he thought no one was listening. One evening, after Maddie was asleep, Ethan and I sat on the porch while crickets filled the silence. I told him what Robert had said. Ethan looked troubled but unsurprised. He had seen enough of my father to know that the man prized power above all. Maybe the law was just another weapon in his arsenal. He urged me to be careful, to protect Maddie from the storm that might be brewing. But storms have a way of finding you, no matter how you brace yourself. And soon enough, I stumbled on proof that the whispers were true. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that begins with packing lunches and ends with folding laundry. Maddie was at school, Ethan was preparing lessons, and I had stopped by the courthouse to drop off papers for the Veterans Outreach program I had started volunteering with. I told myself I was not there for my father, but in truth, some part of me always looked for him, if only to measure the distance between us. That was when I saw Nathan in the hallway. He was standing with two men I did not recognize, men in suits that looked too sharp for this town, their eyes scanning the corridor as if they were guarding something more than conversation. Nathan's shoulders were tight, his voice low. I caught just enough to hear the words settlement and sealed, the kind of words that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with keeping things buried. When his eyes flicked up and met mine, color drained from his face. He excused himself quickly, catching my arm with a grip harder than necessary. "You should not be here," he whispered. There was fear in his voice, not annoyance, not irritation. Fear. My brother, the golden boy who had always been so sure of himself, was afraid, and in that moment I knew Robert's warnings were not just suspicions. Something was rotten, and Nathan was caught in it. Later that night I confronted him. I drove to his apartment. A sleek new building far nicer than what a young attorney should afford on his salary. He looked exhausted when he opened the door, dark circles under his eyes, his tie loosened as if he had been strangled by the very job that made him shine. I told him I had seen him at the courthouse, that I knew something was wrong. At first, he denied it. He said I misunderstood, that I had no idea how the system worked, that my years in uniform made me too blunt for the delicate art of the law. But when I pressed harder, when I told him Robert had warned me, the facade cracked. His voice trembled as he confessed that our father had pulled him into a circle of men whose power stretched farther than our town, men who made problems disappear for those who paid enough. Cases that should have gone to trial were quietly sealed, charges evaporated, victims left in the cold while perpetrators walked free. Nathan hated it, but he could not escape. Our father had bound him to it, promising legacy, promising influence, promising that he was building something greater than himself. I listened, the bile rising in my throat. I had fought in wars believing I was defending freedom, believing that justice, however flawed, still mattered. And here was my own father twisting justice into a commodity, selling it like land or cattle, passing it down to his son as if it were an inheritance. Nathan's hands shook as he poured himself a drink. He said he wanted out, but every time he tried, our father reminded him of debts, of favors owed, of the ruin that would follow if he turned against the family. He said he feared for his career, for his future. For a moment, I saw the boy I grew up with, the boy who once whispered apologies to me after my father's rages, the boy who had been swept into a current too strong to fight. I wanted to shake him, to tell him that no career was worth his soul, that he had to stand against our father. But I knew fear. I knew how it could trap you, how it could make you believe you were powerless. So instead, I placed my hand on his and said softly that he was not alone, that I had faced men with guns in their hands and hate in their eyes, and I had learned one thing above all: bullies only hold power if you give it to them. He looked at me then, tears gathering, and whispered that he wished he had my courage. I told him courage was not born in battlefields. Courage was born in the choice to tell the truth when lies were easier. He did not answer, but I saw something shift in his gaze, a flicker of hope or maybe desperation. Driving home, I felt the weight of it pressing on me. This was no longer just about old wounds between father and daughter. This was about corruption that bled into the very heart of our community. Families torn apart, victims silenced, justice denied. And my own brother standing on the edge of being consumed by it. That night I could not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table while Ethan graded papers beside me. Finally, I told him everything. He listened without interruption, his brow furrowed, his hands steady on mine. When I finished, he let out a long breath and said what I already knew. If you go after him, it will tear this family apart. I looked him in the eye and answered, maybe it needs to be torn apart. Because some things are not worth saving. The next week I met Robert again. We walked by the river where the air was sharp with autumn and leaves drifted like embers across the water. I told him what Nathan had confessed. His jaw tightened and I saw the Marine in him surface, the man who had fought his own battles long before mine. He said he had gathered evidence, bits and pieces over the years, whispers from those brave enough to speak. But he had never had someone inside, someone like Nathan, who could confirm it. He handed me a folder, thick and heavy, filled with documents, photographs, names. I opened it and felt my stomach churn. Cases I remembered from the news. Cases that had vanished without resolution, all linked back to the same circle of men. And at the center, my father. Closing the folder, I felt the silence of my childhood return, that crushing silence that demanded obedience. But this time I was not 12 years old. I was a soldier who had survived wars meant to break me, and I knew then that the real war had only just begun. It was my mother who extended the invitation. Her voice on the phone was soft, rehearsed, as if she were reading from a script. She said my father wanted the family together for dinner, that Nathan would be there, that it was important. She did not say why it was important, only that it was. I could hear the tremor under her words, the same tremor I remembered from childhood, the one she tried to hide behind polished manners and perfect hair. Ethan asked me if I was sure about going. We both knew what would happen inside that house, but Maddie overheard and asked if we could go. She still believed in grandparents the way children believe in fairy tales, no matter how many times the story disappoints them. And maybe part of me wanted her to see it for herself, to understand the truth without me having to explain it. The night was cold and clear when we pulled into the long driveway. The house loomed in the dark, windows glowing like watchful eyes. I remembered the sound of my boots on that porch as a child, the way the heavy door seemed to close me inside a cage. Tonight I walked in not as a frightened girl, but as a woman who had carried rifles and buried friends. Still, my stomach knotted as the air grew thick with memories. The dining room looked unchanged. The mahogany table stretched long and formal, the chandelier above glinting like ice. My father stood at the head of the table, his suit pressed. His tie knotted perfectly. My mother hovered nearby, adjusting silverware that needed no adjusting. Nathan was already seated, his face pale, his glass of wine untouched. Ethan placed his hand lightly on my back as we entered. Maddie clutched my hand, her eyes wide at the grandness of it all. For her, it was like stepping into another world. For me, it was like stepping back into the same prison I had fought so hard to escape. We sat. The clink of silverware was the only sound for a while. My father began the conversation with practiced charm, asking Ethan about his teaching, about whether he planned to advance into administration. His tone was sharp, disguised as polite inquiry, but I heard the undertone. "You are not enough. You will never be enough." Ethan answered calmly, speaking of the joy he found in teaching history, in helping students see how the past shaped the present. My father's mouth tightened. He said teaching high school was hardly fitting for a man married to a Hayes. He called it small. He called it ordinary. Then he looked directly at Ethan and said he had married beneath my station, that my choice had embarrassed this family. The words hit like a slap, not to Ethan, who held steady, but to me, because I knew this was not about him. This was about me. It always had been. Something inside me broke open then, something I had carried since the first time my father told me I was a disgrace. I stood slowly, my chair scraping back across the floor. My voice came out steady, though my heart pounded like mortar fire. I told him I had seen men die in deserts halfway around the world, men who never made it home to families waiting for them. I told him I had held brothers in arms as their last breaths left them, and in those moments there was no such thing as beneath or above. There was only humanity, stripped raw and equal. That, I said, was honor, not the polished wood of his courtroom, not the power he wielded like a weapon, not the lies he built his legacy on. The room was silent. My mother's hand trembled against her glass. Nathan stared at his plate. Maddie pressed herself closer to Ethan, sensing the storm though not the words. My father's face flushed red, his jaw tight. He told me I had no right to lecture him about honor, that I had turned my back on my family, that I was nothing but a soldier who could not survive outside of orders. And that was when I reached into my bag. My hands did not shake. I pulled out the folder Robert had given me, thick with evidence, heavy with truth. I laid it on the table in front of him. The sound echoed in the room like a gunshot. I told him I knew, about the cases, about the settlements, about the lives ruined so that his power could remain intact. I told him I had evidence, names, photographs, records. I told him his empire of lies was collapsing. And for once in his life, he could not control the narrative. His eyes locked on mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It was a standoff like the ones I had seen overseas when the air grew so taut you could feel it ready to snap. He reached for the folder, opened it, scanned the first page. His hand stilled. Then slowly he closed it again and pushed it back toward me. His voice was calm when he spoke, but I knew that calm. It was the calm before violence. He said I did not understand the game being played, that I was meddling in affairs too big for me, that I would bring ruin not only on him, but on all of us. He said Nathan's career would be destroyed, my mother would be humiliated, Maddie would grow up carrying shame. He looked at Ethan and called him weak, a man who could not protect his own wife from her own foolishness. That was the moment I realized he would never change. Not for me, not for Nathan, not for anyone. His legacy was all that mattered, and if he had to drag us all into the mud to protect it, he would. I straightened my shoulders and told him something I had never said before. I am not afraid of you, not anymore. The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever known in that house. My father's eyes blazed with fury, but for the first time I did not shrink under them. For the first time I saw him not as the giant who had ruled my childhood, but as a man, flawed and fragile in his desperate need for control. Dinner ended without dessert. We left the house in silence, Maddie holding tight to Ethan's hand, my mother avoiding my eyes, Nathan trailing behind us with his shoulders slumped. The night air felt sharp and clean when we stepped outside like freedom, but I knew it was only the beginning, because the moment I placed that folder on the table, the war stopped being quiet. The silence in the car on the way home was suffocating. Maddie fell asleep in the back seat, her head tilted against the window, her small breaths fogging the glass. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I stared out into the night, watching the blur of streetlights, my mind replaying every word, every look, every flicker of rage in my father's eyes. I had been in ambushes where the danger was invisible until it struck. Tonight felt the same. We had walked away, but the real attack was still waiting. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You know he won't let this go." His voice was quiet, but the weight in it was undeniable. I nodded, my throat tight. I knew. My father had built his life on control, and I had just ripped the mask off in front of his family. He would not forgive that. He would retaliate. And this time, the battlefield was not halfway around the world. It was my own home. The next morning, I found the first sign of it. Ethan received an email from the school board questioning his teaching methods, hinting at complaints from parents. He read it with disbelief, then looked at me with the kind of grim clarity soldiers know when they recognize the enemy's first move. It was too neat, too sudden. My father's fingerprints were all over it. He was attacking the man I loved, the man he had called unworthy, trying to break him down the way he had always broken me. Ethan folded the letter carefully and said he would fight it. I touched his hand and told him he would not be fighting alone. For years, I had swallowed my father's poison in silence. Not anymore. That afternoon, Robert came to the house. He looked graver than I had ever seen him. He told me word had spread quickly that the old guard of politicians who orbited my father were circling wagons, preparing to discredit me. They would call me unstable, scarred by war, unfit to be taken seriously. They would try to paint Robert as a bitter veteran chasing ghosts. They would bury the evidence under an avalanche of doubt. I felt the familiar burn of fury rise in me. I had been underestimated before. I had been dismissed, silenced, ignored. But underestimation is a weapon I learned to turn back on my enemies. If they thought I was broken, they would never see how strong I had become. That night, Nathan showed up at my door. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling. He said our father had called him into chambers, told him that if he sided with me, he would lose everything. His career, his standing, his future. Nathan's voice cracked as he said he did not know what to do. He had spent his life under our father's shadow, and stepping out of it felt like stepping into fire. I told him he had a choice, that he could either keep serving a man who twisted justice into a business, or he could stand for something real. I told him fear had ruled our family for too long. He stared at me, tears brimming, and whispered that he wished he had my strength. I shook my head and told him strength was not something you wait for. It is something you decide. For a moment, I thought he might choose silence again. But then Maddie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes, asking why Uncle Nathan was sad. Nathan looked at her and something in his face broke. He whispered that he would not let her grow up under the same lies we did. And in that moment, I knew he had chosen. The days that followed were a blur of whispers, phone calls, meetings in quiet corners. Robert brought allies from his old Marine network, men and women who had fought their own battles with corruption. Ethan stood firm at my side, refusing to let the attacks at school shake him. Nathan gathered what he knew. Documents and names that connected the dots inside the courthouse. Piece by piece, the picture grew clearer, darker, undeniable. My father, sensing the walls closing in, struck harder. He tried to freeze Nathan out of cases, threatened to smear him as incompetent. He pushed stories into the local press about my supposed instability, citing anonymous sources who claimed I was violent, unhinged, dangerous. Reading those words made me sick. They had turned my scars into weapons against me, but I had learned long ago that scars are not shame, they are proof of survival. The breaking point came one evening when my father showed up at my door. Ethan opened it, and there he was, looming on the porch in his immaculate suit, his eyes cold. Maddie was upstairs, thankfully asleep. Robert was in the kitchen, his presence steady as always. My father stepped inside without waiting for permission. He looked at me and said I was destroying the family, that I had been poisoned by war, that I was letting bitterness guide me. He said if I continued, he would see to it that Ethan lost his job, that Nathan was disbarred, that even Maddie would pay the price in whispers and shame. I felt the rage rise, hot and clean, but beneath it was something steadier, something I had carried from the desert to this very moment. The knowledge that fear only works when you let it. I stood tall, my voice calm, and told him the truth. That I had fought men who thought terror was power, that I had buried brothers who gave their lives for freedom, that I had learned one unshakable lesson. Bullies fall when you stop bowing to them. I told him I would not bow, neither would Ethan, neither would Nathan. I told him the evidence was safe, already copied, already shared with people he could not reach. I told him his time of control was over. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. It was brief, quickly masked, but it was there. A crack in the armor of the man who had ruled us all with iron. He turned, his words sharp as he left, promising I would regret it. But I knew regret would not be mine. After he left, the house was silent but charged, as if a storm had just passed through. Ethan wrapped his arms around me. Robert poured a drink, his hands steady. Nathan sat at the table, his face pale but resolute. We were no longer fragments scattered by fear. We were allies now, bound not by blood but by choice. That night, as I tucked Maddie into bed, she asked if Grandpa was angry. I told her yes. She asked if we were scared. I thought about it for a moment, then kissed her forehead and said no, because the truth is stronger than fear. As I turned out the light, I realized that the war I had always dreaded was finally here. But this time, I was not fighting alone. The first headline broke on a Tuesday morning. Ethan found it before I did, folded open on the kitchen counter like a warning flare. Judge Hayes accused of covering up homicide. My father's name, bold as war paint, printed above a story that peeled back the curtain on years of whispers. A dead man buried in paperwork, his cause of death conveniently ruled accidental. A local businessman with ties to developers, his empire built on bribes and protection. And behind it all, the shadow of my father's gavel, silencing questions before they could be asked. I read the article twice, every word burning into me. It was not everything we had gathered. Robert had been careful, holding back the most damning evidence until it could not be buried again. But it was enough to start the fire, enough to show the world that my father's honor was a mask. By noon, the phone began ringing non-stop. Reporters, former classmates, strangers with stories of their own. Some wanted the truth, others wanted gossip. Maddie watched me from the kitchen table, her cereal forgotten, her eyes wide. She asked if Grandpa was in trouble. I told her yes. She asked if he would go to jail. I said I did not know. She asked if we were safe. And I told her what I believed with my whole heart. Yes, but safety came at a cost. By evening, my mother showed up at the house. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her perfect posture bent, her eyes red-rimmed. She did not sit down. She stood in my living room like a woman balancing on a cliff, her voice trembling as she asked how I could do this. Did I not understand what it meant for our family, for her reputation, for the life she had built? I looked at her, at the pearls at her throat, at the faint tremor in her hand as she clutched her purse. For so many years she had chosen silence, chosen the safety of appearances over the truth of our pain. I told her I had done this because appearances kill, because lies are the chains that had bound us all. She shook her head and said I was cruel, that I had humiliated them. I wanted to tell her about the battlefield, about the night in Fallujah when silence nearly cost a whole squad their lives, how I learned that the truth spoken too late is as deadly as a bullet, but she would not hear it. She turned away, whispering that I had destroyed everything. After she left, I sat in the quiet, my chest heavy. Robert put his hand on my shoulder, steady as always. Ethan knelt in front of me, his eyes searching mine. He did not say it would be okay. He knew better. He simply said we will stand through this, together. The next day, more came out. Nathan's documents had found their way into the hands of investigators. A pattern of rulings overturned, cases dismissed, evidence buried. My father's allies scrambled, their denials clumsy, their defenses cracking. And the name of the businessman appeared again and again, Gerald Whitmore, dead in a so-called accident a decade earlier. His widow had long suspected foul play, but no one listened. Now the truth clawed its way into daylight. I met her in a diner on the edge of town. She was older, her hair silver, her hands shaking as she held mine. She said thank you over and over, her eyes wet. She told me about the night Gerald died, how he had argued with men tied to the same development projects my father had championed, how she had been warned to stay quiet or risk her children's future. She said she had prayed for years that someone would listen. And now, finally, someone had. Leaving the diner, I felt both the weight of her gratitude and the gravity of what we had unleashed. This was no longer just about my family. It was about every person crushed under the weight of corruption, every voice silenced by power. At home, Ethan sat at the table with Robert. Maps of connections spread before them like battle plans. Nathan came in late, his tie loosened, his face tired but determined. He said the courthouse was a war zone, alliances crumbling, whispers louder than gavel strikes. He said some wanted to protect our father, others wanted to see him burn. I listened, then told them what I had told my mother. This was not revenge. Revenge was a fire that consumed without purpose. What we were doing was different. I wanted Maddie to grow up in truth, not fear. I wanted her to see that silence was not survival. The room was quiet after I spoke. Then Robert nodded, a slow, steady motion like a Marine accepting orders he already believed in. Ethan reached for my hand. Nathan exhaled, his shoulders easing, as if for the first time he understood why I had chosen this fight. That night I dreamed of Afghanistan, not the firefights or the blood, but the children. Little girls chasing each other through dust, their laughter defiant in a place where fear was currency. I woke before dawn, my face wet with tears. Maddie was asleep in the next room, safe. And I knew that every choice I had made was for her. By the end of that week, subpoenas had been issued. Investigators called for testimony. The press circled like hawks, every headline another blade slicing through the facade my father had built. Judge William Hayes, once untouchable, now stood on the edge of collapse. And in the center of it all, I stood too, not as a daughter seeking vengeance, but as a soldier who had fought one war and refused to let another steal the soul of her family. The first time I saw my father falter in public, it was on the courthouse steps. Reporters had gathered like a swarm, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. Judge Hayes, the man who once walked those marble stairs as if they were carved for his feet alone, stumbled. His voice cracked as he denied the accusations, his face flushed as he barked at the questions. He looked less like a judge and more like a cornered man. I watched the footage on the evening news. My hands wrapped tight around a mug of coffee gone cold. Ethan sat beside me, his arm brushing mine, silent but steady. Robert stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. Nathan was on the phone, trying to calm colleagues who wanted to know which side of history he planned to stand on. I barely heard their words. All I could see was my father's face, the mask slipping, the empire cracking. But he was not done fighting. 2 nights later, Ethan's car was vandalized outside the school. The tires slashed, windows shattered, a note scrawled across the hood in spray paint, "Traitor." The police wrote it up as petty vandalism, but we knew better. My father's allies were sending a message. Ethan stared at the wreck, his shoulders stiff. I waited for him to curse, to rage, to tell me this was too much. Instead, he turned to me with a calm I did not expect. He said, "They can break glass, but they cannot break us." And I loved him more fiercely in that moment than I ever had before. The next blow came for Nathan. A rumor spread through the courthouse that he had fabricated evidence, that he was bitter about being overlooked for promotions. His reputation, the one thing he had fought to build under our father's shadow, was suddenly at risk. He called me late one night, his voice shaking, asking if we had done the right thing. I reminded him of Maddie's eyes when she asked if we were safe. I reminded him of Gerald Whitmore's widow, her hands trembling as she finally told her truth. This fight was bigger than us, I told him. And for the first time, Nathan did not argue. Meanwhile, my mother retreated into silence. Friends whispered that she was not leaving the house, that she drew the curtains even in daylight. I imagined her pacing the empty rooms, clutching at the shreds of the life she had once defended so fiercely. She had chosen appearances for so long that she did not know who she was without them. And though part of me ached for her, another part knew this was the reckoning she had always avoided. The turning point came when the state attorney announced formal charges, covering up evidence, abuse of judicial power, obstruction of justice. My father was ordered to surrender his gavel. The sight of him, stripped of authority, walking out of the courthouse not as Judge Hayes, but as William Hayes, citizen under suspicion, lit something in the community. For decades, he had been the man others bowed to. Now he was just another man standing before the law. It was not victory, not yet, but it was justice cracking the door open, and still the attacks did not stop. One evening, as I walked Maddie home from school, a car slowed beside us. The window rolled down and a voice spat venom. "Your mother's a liar. Your father's a hero." Maddie clutched my hand, her eyes wide. I kept my voice calm, my steps steady, and walked faster. When we reached home, I knelt down and looked her in the eyes. I told her that sometimes people fear the truth so much they try to drown it with hate. But hate is noise, truth is stronger. She nodded, though her small fingers trembled in mine. That night, I knew silence was no longer enough. My father had controlled the story for years with fear and intimidation. It was time for me to speak, not to reporters who wanted sound bites, not to politicians who wanted leverage, to the people, to anyone who had ever lived under someone else's shadow and wondered if they could step out. Robert helped me draft the statement. Ethan rehearsed with me, his teacher's patience guiding me through the rhythm of words. Nathan, weary but resolute, promised to stand beside me. And on a Sunday morning, in front of the courthouse steps crowded with cameras and citizens, I took the microphone. My hands did not shake. My voice did not waver. I told them my name. I told them I was a soldier who had served 12 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. I told them I had seen what happens when people in power crush the truth, when silence is enforced by fear. I said the battlefield had followed me home, not with bullets or bombs, but with lies and manipulation. And I told them why I stood there that day. I am not here for revenge. Revenge consumes. I am here because my daughter deserves to grow up in truth, not fear. Because families are broken when lies are allowed to rule. Because honor does not come from titles or robes. It comes from courage. From standing when it is easier to kneel. I saw faces shift in the crowd, some skeptical, some tearful, some lit with recognition. I told them that my father was not the first man to think power was bigger than justice, but he would not be the last unless we all refused to bow. When I finished, there was silence for a long moment, then applause, scattered at first, then rolling through the crowd like a wave. Cameras flashed, voices rose, and for the first time, I felt not like a daughter fighting her father, but like a soldier standing for something larger than herself. That night, threats poured in online, vicious and loud, but messages of support poured in too, from strangers who said my words had given them courage to face their own shadows, veterans who said they understood, survivors who said they felt seen, mothers who said they wanted their children to know the same truth I wanted for Maddie. My father's name continued to bleed across headlines. His allies dwindled. His voice, once booming with authority, grew hoarse with denial. He tried to intimidate. He tried to manipulate, but each move only revealed more of the rot. And through it all, Ethan stood beside me, his quiet strength unshakable. Robert's steady presence anchored us. Nathan, bruised but brave, chose truth again and again. And Maddie, with her small hand tucked in mine, reminded me of why I had started this war in the first place. The fuse had been lit long ago in the silence of a family ruled by fear. Now it burned openly, bright and unstoppable. And though the fire was consuming everything my father had built, it was also lighting the way forward, for me, for Nathan, for Maddie, for anyone who had ever been told that silence was survival. Because the truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again. The day my father was officially suspended from the bench was colder than the calendar said it should be. Early spring had begun to touch the trees with pale green, but the courthouse steps were lined with bare branches and hard faces. Reporters jostled for position as the statement was read aloud. Judge William Hayes, relieved of his duties pending full investigation into corruption and obstruction of justice. For decades, that courthouse had been his kingdom. Now, stripped of his gavel, he walked out as a man exiled from his own empire. I did not watch him in person. I saw it on the television in Robert's kitchen, Maddie curled against my side with her crayons scattered across the table. Ethan stood behind me with a hand on my shoulder. Robert poured us coffee as though it were any other morning, his silence as steady as a promise. But the sight of my father's face, no longer confident, no longer untouchable, sent a strange mixture of sorrow and release through me. He had built his power on silence and fear. Now silence had turned against him, fear no longer obeyed. The community reacted like a body waking from anesthesia. People whispered about the cover-ups, the bribes, the favoritism. Some voices rose in outrage, others in relief. A few still clung to the image of the man he pretended to be. But the myth was broken. Once a mask slips, it can never quite be put back on. For my mother, the shattering was almost unbearable. She called me once, her voice hollow, asking if I was satisfied now. I told her satisfaction was not the word, justice was, and justice is not sweet, it is hard and heavy and necessary. She hung up without another word. For weeks after, I heard little of her until Robert told me she had begun attending meetings at the community center. He said she sat quietly at first, listening to women share stories of bruises hidden beneath sleeves, of controlling voices that ruled their homes. Then one evening she spoke. He did not tell me exactly what she said, only that her voice shook but did not falter. It was the first time in years she had spoken as herself, not as Judge Hayes's wife. Meanwhile, life in our own home shifted. Ethan and I scraped together savings and bought a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy. Just a white clapboard with a porch wide enough for summer evenings. The first night we slept there, Maddie insisted we eat a picnic on the living room floor. She said the house felt like it was breathing, like it was happy to have us. Watching her laugh with mustard on her chin, I felt a peace I had not known in years. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe we were safe, but healing was not a switch to be flipped. Nights still came with shadows. Sometimes I woke drenched in sweat, the sound of gunfire echoing in my mind, the weight of my father's voice pressing on my chest. Ethan would reach for me, his warmth pulling me back to the present, whispering that I was home, I was safe. Other nights, Maddie would crawl into our bed after a nightmare of her own, whispering that Grandpa was chasing her. I held her close and told her what I had told myself on darker days. Fear is a liar. Truth is the only weapon worth carrying. One Saturday afternoon, I sat with her on the porch, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in soft pink. She asked why people had believed Grandpa for so long if he was wrong. I told her people sometimes choose lies because they feel safer than the truth. She frowned, thinking, then said, "But safe isn't always right, is it?" I smiled through the ache in my chest. "No," I told her, "safe isn't always right." That was the moment I began teaching her what no one had taught me as a child, that patience is strength, but silence in the face of injustice is surrender. I told her voice mattered, even when it shook, especially when it shook. She leaned against me, her small hand clutching mine, and I felt the circle breaking, the legacy of silence unraveling thread by thread. Nathan came by often. His career had taken blows, but he stood taller now, his spine straighter, his choices his own. He said he wanted Maddie to know her uncle was someone she could count on. She hugged him fiercely, and I saw tears glisten in his eyes. For so long he had been trapped between obedience and truth. Now he was free, and though the cost was high, freedom always is. Robert, steady as ever, began helping my mother more openly. He drove her to community events, encouraged her to keep speaking. He told me once that she had begun organizing a group to support women leaving abusive homes. He said she smiled again, though the smile was fragile, for the first time in years. She was building something not for appearances, but for survival. As for my father, the investigation deepened. His allies dwindled. The name William Hayes became less a title and more a cautionary tale. He called me once, his voice thick with bitterness, saying I had betrayed him, that blood should have bound us tighter than truth. I listened, then hung up. I had spent my life chained to his definition of family. Now I was free to define it myself. Spring warmed into summer. The house filled with laughter, with the smell of Ethan's grilling, with Maddie's drawings taped to the fridge. But even in peace, there was the shadow of loss. I could not forget the faces of those I had served with, the brothers and sisters who had not made it home. Their absence was a weight I carried every day, and yet in some quiet way their memory became my compass. They had fought for truth larger than themselves. I owed them to live in that truth too. One evening, as fireflies blinked across the yard, Maddie asked if I ever missed being a soldier. I told her I missed my friends, my brothers and sisters in arms. I missed the clarity of knowing who I stood beside, of fighting for something beyond myself. But I told her I did not miss the fear, the violence, the silence after loss. I told her that now my fight was different. My fight was for her. She smiled, her eyes shining, and whispered, "Then we already won." Her words stayed with me long after she went to bed. Maybe she was right. Maybe victory was not the fall of my father or the crumbling of his empire. Maybe it was this small, fragile, ordinary life built on truth instead of lies, on love instead of fear. Maybe survival had finally turned into living. The memorial took place on a Sunday morning in late summer, when the air was heavy with heat, but the sky was clear and endless. Rows of flags lined the path to the veterans' cemetery, their colors snapping in the breeze. The sound alone was enough to take me back, a chorus of fabric and wind, reminders of the banners we carried into places that had no maps. Ethan drove us, his hand resting over mine the whole way. Maddie sat in the back, clutching the small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from our yard. She had insisted on bringing them, whispering that they were brighter than the flowers in the store, and that her daddy's friends deserved something alive and beautiful. I did not correct her. She was right. When we arrived, the place was already crowded. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, some in pressed uniforms, some in worn jackets faded by years and sun. Families gathered with photos pinned to their shirts, names etched on their hearts. The air carried the scent of cut grass and polished stone. It carried the weight of sacrifice, unspoken, but felt in every glance, every bowed head. We found Robert near the front. He wore his old Marine cap, the brim shadowing his eyes. He greeted Maddie first, his weathered hand brushing her cheek before pulling me into a brief, fierce hug. No words were needed. He had carried the weight of his wars just as I carried mine. Today was about remembering, not explaining. The ceremony began with a prayer, followed by the slow toll of a bell. Each chime was a name, a life cut short, a story unfinished. As the list went on, I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. Faces flickered in my mind: Daniels, who sang country songs off-key under the desert stars. Morales, who wrote letters to his mother every night, folded with precision like origami. Sarah Thompson, fierce and brilliant, who had patched me up more than once with steady hands. The bell rang, and I whispered their names under my breath, as if saying them could keep them alive. When the bugle began to play taps, the air seemed to hold its breath. The notes were pure and mournful, rising into the sky like smoke. Maddie leaned against me, her small hand in mine, her eyes wide and solemn. She did not fidget, did not ask questions. Somehow, even at her age, she understood the gravity. After the ceremony ended, people lingered, laying flowers, sharing quiet embraces. I led Maddie to a row of stones marked with familiar names. Kneeling, I placed her bouquet down, arranging the wildflowers against the cool granite. The colors looked defiant against the gray, as if to say that life still bloomed even here. I whispered softly, "This time I came home for good." The words surprised me even as I spoke them. For years, home had been a place I could not touch, a memory blurred by fear and distance. But now, with Ethan beside me, with Maddie's hand in mine, with Robert steady at my shoulder, home was real. It was not perfect, it was not free of scars, but it was mine. As I rose, I caught sight of my mother in the distance. She stood with a small group of women from the community center, her posture no longer brittle but tentative, like a tree bending towards sunlight after years of shade. Our eyes met across the rows of stones. For the first time, I did not see only silence in her. I saw choice. She nodded once, a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a bridge being built. I nodded back. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. We walked back to the car in the thick afternoon heat. Maddie skipped ahead, chasing dragonflies, her laughter breaking the heaviness. Ethan slipped his arm around my waist, pulling me close. He murmured that the hardest battles are never the ones with rifles, they are the ones inside us. I leaned into him, grateful for his quiet strength, for the steadiness that had carried me when my own knees threatened to buckle. Driving home, the landscape blurred into fields and fences, the horizon stretching wide. Maddie sang softly in the back seat, her voice bright, her flowers now gone but her spirit light. I closed my eyes and let the sound settle in me. Later, as twilight painted the porch in gold, I sat with Maddie while Ethan grilled dinner. She asked me why soldiers wear medals. I told her they were symbols. Reminders of bravery, sacrifice, honor. She thought for a moment, then said, "You should have won." I laughed softly and told her I did not need a medal. I had her. She wrinkled her nose and said that did not count, but I knew it counted more than anything. That night, after Maddie was asleep, I stood in the doorway of her room and watched her breathe. Her chest rose and fell, her curls spread across the pillow, her fingers clutching the edge of her blanket. The simple peace of her sleep undid me. For so long, I had lived waiting for the next attack, the next betrayal, the next wound. But here was proof that not all cycles repeat, that the story could change. Downstairs, Robert and Ethan sat at the table, the remnants of dinner still scattered. They spoke in low voices, comfortable, unhurried. I joined them, and for the first time in a long time, I felt not like a soldier in retreat, but like a woman rebuilding. The war inside my family had taken years, had cost pieces of me I could never reclaim, but tonight I had something worth keeping. Before bed, I stepped onto the porch. The night was quiet. Stars scattered like watchfires across the sky. I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and whispered again, "This time I came home for good." The words settled into me not as a hope, but as a truth, because home was not a house or a town. It was Ethan's steady hand, Maddie's laughter, Robert's loyalty, Nathan's newfound courage, even my mother's tentative steps toward freedom. It was a life lived in the open, not in the shadows, and it was mine to keep. Looking back, I realized this was never simply a family revenge story. It was the long road of a soldier learning how to come home. The battlefield I fought overseas had clear lines, uniforms, and orders. The battlefield I walked into here was quieter, but no less dangerous. It was in the silence of dinner tables, in the shadows of power, in the wounds carried for generations. and it took me years to understand that the greatest victory is not defeating an enemy, but choosing not to let their darkness shape the future. I thought once that blood defined family, that loyalty meant swallowing pain for the sake of a name. But I learned that family is not about whose eyes look like yours or whose last name you carry. Family is the place where you are safe to be yourself, where love outweighs fear, where truth matters more than appearances. For so long, I lived under the weight of my father's voice, a voice that told me honor meant obedience. That power mattered more than kindness, but real strength is something different. Real strength is the ability to break the cycle, to draw the line and say it ends here. It is the decision to protect your child from the silence you once endured. It is finding the courage to stand tall even when your knees shake. I have come to believe that veterans, especially women who wore the uniform, carry within us a kind of quiet resilience. We are trained to fight battles with rifles and strategy, but when the war ends, another begins. The war of finding your place in a world that does not understand where you have been. The war of carrying scars that do not show. The war of facing down the echoes of control and fear, not in far-off deserts, but in our own living rooms. And yet we rise. Again and again, we rise. When I sat with my daughter and told her never to stay silent in the face of injustice, I knew that was the true victory, not the fall of a judge, not the headlines, but the breaking of a chain that had bound us for too long. She will grow up knowing that her voice matters, that patience is a strength, but silence is not survival. And in her laughter, in her questions, in her fearless little heart, I see a future brighter than anything my past could dim. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Military Revenge. Share it with someone who might need the reminder that courage is not always about battles fought overseas. Sometimes it is about standing up at your own kitchen table. And for me, that is the battle I finally won.